Hello and welcome to Tech Deals. Ryzen 2 is coming April 19th, 2018. Ryzen 2 is fully launching with two new Ryzen 5 and two new Ryzen 7 CPUs and new motherboards. The X470 boards are launching. B450s are launching later. They are not coming at launch. New coolers, including a brand new top-end cooler, and finally, every CPU comes with a cooler. No more of this, you have to buy your own cooler nonsense. Higher clock speeds, 4.3 gigahertz out of the box max turbo speed. Finally, we've got some competitive clock speeds relative to Intel. Now, in this video, I'm going to be talking about the new CPUs, briefly the new motherboards, recommendations on what I think you should buy and not buy, and then links down in the description below to pre-order everything at Amazon and Newegg because pre-orders are up and live now. Now, I understand some people will watch this and say, well, shouldn't I wait for the full review, all the performance testing, which you can't see until April 19th? Perhaps, but Ryzen 2 is a refresh. It's Zen Plus, not Zen 2 of the first Ryzen launch. Clock speeds are higher, RAM support is higher, I'll talk about that. The coolers are better, the temps are good, and the 1800X is gone. We didn't get a 2800X, which I'm actually really glad of because frankly, I thought there was one too many Ryzen 7 parts. So with all that out of the way, I've got some coolers here and some motherboards to talk about. Let's get on with it. The first thing you need to know is that all of these CPUs will work in existing motherboards. B350 and X370 will accept all the new Ryzen 2 CPUs with a BIOS update. If you buy one of these older boards, you find one at a sale or discount, and it has not had its BIOS updated, well, it'll need to be. But in all fairness, at this point, if you have not yet bought into Ryzen, I would simply buy an X470 board, which are launching at the same time as these. But if you have maybe a lower-end Ryzen 3 or Ryzen 5 and you want to step up, maybe from a 4-core to a 6-core or a 6-core to an 8-core, not to worry, you don't have to change your motherboard. Should you? No. There are improvements on the X470 boards, but nothing worth the trouble of tearing out your motherboard and changing it over. Thank you, AMD, for finally supporting multiple generations. They will also support Ryzen 3, which is actually Zen 2 coming in 2019, which also means that if you have an existing 300 series or the new 400 series, not to worry, it'll be supported next year and in 2020 as well. What we are not getting with this launch are standard 4-core and 4-core 8-thread processors. The Ryzen 3 and lower-end Ryzen 5s already launched in February, and that's these APUs right here. The Ryzen 3 2200G and the Ryzen 4 2400G are all we're getting at that level. The lowest-end mainline Ryzen 2 CPU is the Ryzen 2 2600. 6 cores, 12 threads, but there's an important change. The Ryzen 5 1600 came with this cooler right here, the excellent Wraith Spire cooler, copper core plug on the bottom, 95 watt TDP, excellent cooler. The new Ryzen 5 2600 comes with the Wraith Stealth that you can see here. They've reshuffled the coolers around. The 2600X, also 6 cores, 12 threads, does come with the Wraith Spire cooler. It is $30 more, $229 versus $199, but it also has higher clock speeds out of the box, a higher XFR auto overclocking, and, as I mentioned, a better cooler. It is Ryzen 7 where things get really interesting. $299 for the Ryzen 7 2700. 8 cores, 16 threads, 4.1 gigahertz max turbo speed, but a 3.2 gigahertz base. It will come with the Wraith Spire RGB cooler, the one you see here in the middle. It's an excellent cooler, no issues. That is a 65 watt TDP chip, so the cooler is just fine and it can handle a mild overclock, but not a huge one. The Ryzen 7 2700X is the really interesting one. 4.3 gigahertz max turbo speed with a 3.7 base, $329. It is only 10% more money than the non-X chip, and it includes the Wraith Prism cooler, which is very similar to the one you see here. This is the older Wraith Max, but it is much larger, and again, 50% cooling performance over the Wraith Spire, which is the Wraith Spire over the Stealth. More overclocking ability, better cooling. You really shouldn't have to replace it. The Wraith Prism is a new modified version because the entire fan is clear now. Instead of just an RGB ring on the center of it, the whole center of it lights up. It's much, much prettier than the previous version. So if you want some RGB lighting in your case, yes, that's still a thing, then the new Wraith Prism cooler is much nicer than the RGB Spire, which just has the ring. In my opinion, the deal by far is the 2700X. $329 is only $30 more than the non-X 2700, but for that money, you get a 500 megahertz higher base clock speed, you get a better turbo speed, and you get a better cooler. The cooler alone is easily worth 50% of the price difference, $15-ish for the better cooler, if not more. And then the guaranteed higher clock speed out of the box for the other $15. If you're going to Ryzen 7, in my opinion, it's 2700X or bust. In fact, I have ordered a 2700X and I have not ordered a 2700. I'm not even going to bother. If you're spending $300 on your CPU and $150 to $200 on a motherboard, $30 to get a 500 megahertz guaranteed faster speed and a superior cooler is an absolute no-brainer in my opinion. If you need further encouragement to buy the X chip, let me offer you this thought. For $30 in your otherwise $1,000+ computer build, you're buying easy, peace of mind, and hassle-free. No worrying about voltages and overclocking and tweaking settings. Yes, you can buy the 2700 and overclock it, but for $30 to just not have to worry about it, to have guaranteed stability, that's a deal in my book. Now, coming back to the Ryzen 5s, the price gap is a little bit larger than 10%. It's still $30 on less expensive chips. And if you were going to go with custom cooling anyway, then you don't care that it comes with a Wraith Stealth cooler. I would not run, if you want to overclock, a Ryzen 5 2600 on the Stealth, but if you plan to replace it with, say, a liquid cooler or a custom cooler, Hyper 212 Evo, Hyper 612, or a Be Quiet or Noctua air cooler, then the cooler doesn't matter. I could then understand the argument for a Ryzen 5 2600. Still, that being said, unless you're really tight on money, I think this cooler is perfectly adequate. I would use it with the 2600X. The $30 isn't a huge ask. You do get a bit of a higher clock speed boost. It isn't as big a jump as the Ryzen 7s is, but it is a nice jump, and basically it removes the overclocking headaches and hassles from you. It's the easy solution. Now, a couple of brief notes on the new X470 chipset versus the X370. There are actually not a lot of changes. One of the biggest is now DDR4 3466 support. Mostly, depending upon the RAM that you have still, that's not going to be a guaranteed thing, but what it does mean is that DDR4 3200 will be better supported. RAM support is still not perfect on Ryzen, but it's pretty darn good. The X470 boards also have 3rd gen PCI Express chipset lanes versus the 2nd gen chipset lanes on, the 3, which is a pretty minor thing overall, but if you're using NVMe drives and other high-speed devices, especially something in the 2nd slot for the premium boards, it's nice to have. There's 2 more phases and better VRM and better VRM cooling, and the chipset itself uses less power. These are all very, very minor adjustments. If I already had an X370 board, would I replace it? Absolutely not under any circumstances. It makes no sense to spend that kind of money. That being said, if there's a $20 to $30 price increase from going from an X370 to an X470, if you're looking at one of these chips and thinking, well, it's maybe $140 for the X370 version and $160 for the X470, yes, I'd buy the X470 for $20 or $30 more. It is a little bit better. It is a little bit more refined. It is designed for these, even though they work both ways. 1st gen chips work on 400 series, 2nd gen chips work on 300 series. But at least with a 400 series, you're guaranteed to have the latest and greatest. I mentioned at the beginning of the video, B450s are not launching here. The B350s are remaining and, of course, do support with a BIOS update these processors. I do expect over the coming weeks or perhaps 2 or 3 months, just like Intel, we will get a B450 update and boards below $100. At launch, the least expensive X470 board is $139. And if you're inclined to buy a Ryzen 5 2600, that's a lot of money for a motherboard for a $199 CPU, whereas you can buy B350s in the $79 price range that are perfectly good for a CPU like that. And that's actually not a terrible idea. If you're looking for a budget option and you go with the $199 chip, a B350 might be something to consider. One more last note on the coolers. I do want to emphasize there is a real solid, honest-to-goodness difference between the 3 levels of coolers that AMD provides, and if you're going to use the included cooler, I really do think it's worth stepping up to the X chips to get them, even if you don't care about the extra clock speed. On the Ryzen 5 front, these are the 2 coolers you get with the X chip and the non-X chip. The Stealth and the Spire are both good coolers, but the Spire is much nicer. On the bottom, we have a real copper plug here on the Spire, whereas it's just aluminum on the Stealth. There is much more cooling material on the Spire versus the Stealth. It is much heavier and it's just a much nicer cooler overall. If you want better performance in a cooler running system, I really do think the Spire is worth the money. Coming over to the Ryzen 7 side, I even more think it makes sense. Now, the Spire is very good, and on Ryzen 7 2700, you do get the RGB ring and, of course, the copper plate. But on the Wraith Prism, besides the RGB, you get a real full coverage plate on the bottom that provides more cooling. Now, the Wraith Prism has 4 direct contact heat pipes, just like a Hyper 212 Evo, which is superior to the Spire cooler. And one of the other features I really like about it is it uses the clip-on plates to, rather you don't have to screw it down to the board and mess with the back plate. So the existing mounts on the motherboards, it just simply clips onto both sides, and frankly, I think it's a very easy mounting solution, but that's a minor thing. If you're going Ryzen 7, do yourself a favor, get the Wraith Prism, get the 2700X. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with the big huge red button directly below. Questions and comments in the comment section, and pre-orders to everything are linked down in the video description. The CPUs, multiple motherboard choices, both the new X470s as well as the B350s if you're going the budget side with the Ryzen 5. And I would like to point out that if you want something below this, I will also link to the Ryzen APUs down there. 4 cores, 4 threads on the Ryzen 3, 4 cores, 8 threads on the Ryzen 5 2400G. If you're looking for a budget solution, those are both worth considering. The integrated graphics are really, really good on those. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.